Namaste and in Lak'ech, and welcome to this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and this week's guest is Riane Eisler. She is well known for her book, The Chalice and the Blade. She has continued her work into understanding how to build effective partnerships and what that takes in an evolving world. She's got decades of research and study that's gone into her work. You've got to listen to this conversation. It could literally change your life. Stick with us. We'll be right back. So, Riane, it is such a pleasure to have you here and to be able to explore the world that you have been engaged in for so long and the value, the insight, the wisdom that you've garnered and can share from that. So thank you very much for taking time out and being with us.
Well, thank you.
In our explorations, as you already know, we look for that ability to bring the inner into the outer world. By that, I mean we're bereft of the inner self that we have. We live half inside, half outside. We don't talk about what's going on inside, and it's often kind of bizarre and crazy. And so, when articulating that to others, they can perceive us to be a little weird. However, that doesn't make what's happening any less important to talk about. And so that's kind of what we're doing with the efforts with One World and a New World. So thank you for jumping in and being able to share your story too. So speaking of your story, where did it all begin? With the work that you're doing, you had to have had an early inner awareness, connection, voice, vision, something that indicated that there was more to life and that you had some role in helping it.
Well, my passion for this work, and I have a lot of passion for it, was really started in my early childhood. I was a child refugee with my parents from the Nazis,
Mm.
my native Vienna. And from one day to the next, my whole world, uh, you know, from being a cute little kid that people patted on the head, my parents and I, we became hunted with license to kill. And on Crystal Night, so-called because of all the glass shattered in Jewish homes and synagogues and workplaces, a gang of Gestapo people, both Austrian and German, came and broke into our house and dragged my father off. And I, of course, traumatic, really. I witnessed cruelty and violence,
To the
insensitivity.
extreme.
Beg your pardon?
To the extreme.
To the extreme. But I also witnessed something else that night that I think profoundly affected me. It's what I today call spiritual courage.
Mm.
And it was the courage of my mother to stand up against injustice out of love. And she recognized one of the men, the Gestapo men, as a young Austrian who had been an errand boy for the family business. And she got furious. She said, "How dare you do this to this man who has been so good to you? I want him back." Now, my mother could have been killed. Many Jewish people were killed that night. But by a miracle, she wasn't. Some money eventually passed hands, of course, but my father was released and we managed to escape in the middle of the night from my native Austria. And they also managed to purchase an entry permit to Cuba, where I grew up. One of the only two places, Shanghai and Cuba,
Mm.
that sold these to desperate Jewish refugees. And I grew up in the industrial slums of Havana, where I experienced and witnessed another injustice, the extreme differences between those on top and those on bottom,
Mhm.
in poverty at that time. So these questions led me, well, these experiences led me to questions like, does it have to be this way? I think questions that many of us have
Yeah,
asked.
the obvious simple ones. Why?
Yeah.
Right?
And does it have to be this way?
Yeah.
We're told all these stories like original sin, selfish genes, right? You were bad. That's just
Yeah.
quote human nature, which is totally a lie, by the way.
Oh, yeah. The actions are evil. It's not the people, it's the behaviors and what they're pushed to do without regard.
And that largely, of course, these questions were, is there an alternative? And if so, what is it?
Mhm.
And many years later, uh, I embarked on my multidisciplinary cross-cultural transhistorical research to
That's a
answer.
mouthful.
Yes, I'm really a systems scientist because I look at the whole system.
Oh, I love that. I had a conversation with Dr. Urban Laszlo, who's also, as comes from that quantum systems viewpoint. So I love that you're one of those early pioneers who explored this area out of need, first of all, and yet out of courage, second, because you continued the work.
Well, Irvin, I've known him for a long time. Um, and as a matter of fact, I recently interviewed him for our journal, the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, which is housed at the University of Minnesota. It's peer-reviewed, um, and it's basically inspired by my work. Um, so yes, well,
I'll make sure we reference that in the description.
yes, well, you have my bio, I'm sure,
Yes.
or you can get it from our website, centerforpartnership.org. Um, but in any case, the answer to my question was, and specifically to the question of, is there an alternative, was a resounding yes. But we can't see it looking through the conventional lenses of the
Or linear
categories
thinking.
and the studies
Yeah.
that we've inherited. Um, so, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, because they fragment our
Always the
consciousness.
verses rather than the yes and.
Well, it isn't only that, none of them, well, first of all, none of them, there have been repressive, violent regimes in every one of these categories. So none answer that question.
Right.
But beyond that, and this is a huge part of my whole systems analysis, they marginalize or ignore the majority of humanity, women and children.
Mhm. Well,
And
and
if
Howard
you
Bloom even says, pardon me, I'm just trying to, yes, and I want to add to this in that, one of the world's greatest minds today, Howard Bloom, wrote a book, The Lucifer Principle, in which he revealed a scientific study of history of how a few people manipulated populations with lies and controlled the media.
Well, my work is not only about deconstruction,
Mhm.
it's about reconstruction,
Most important, in my opinion.
the positive,
Yeah,
because, I mean, we have started, especially during the last 300 years, to critique what I call a domination system, but we're getting ahead of our story in a sense.
sure.
Um, and
Tendency of us to leap forward, right?
well, I think that our attention span, of course, due to social media, has been really shrunk.
Mhm.
Um, and I write long books. The first one was The Chalice and the Blade, which is now in its, uh, I think it's 56th or 57th US
And
printing.
what a historic work that is, too.
It is a historic work. And it has been translated into about 30 foreign editions. But I've written many books since then, The latest one is Nurturing Our Humanity, which came out with Oxford University Press in 2019,
Mm.
drawing very heavily from neuroscience, which really verifies my findings, which is that we have to look at the social context of our behavior
Mhm.
because it shapes us.
It's even, I don't know if you're familiar with Valentina Morovina.
No?
She is a Russian academician who was given the title from her dissertation called the the global mutation in humanity. And what she's done is she's taken the last 10 years of scientific research and pulled out the data that demonstrates that, yeah, we are in a genetic change that's moving us all upward in our response capability and the knowledge that through this scientific discovery now, we know that everything's connected. And so she's edifying what quantum physics is saying, what systems engineering is saying, and kind of taking it to a next level is that, yeah, it's built in, and here's the proof.
But my research verifies that everything is interconnected. For example, in Putin, he's a dictator, of course, in Russia. Uh, Recently, in 2018, was very instrumental in changing and lowering the penalty for family violence in Russia. I mean, so if you kill a child or hurt a child or a woman in in a nation which, as you know, is well known for its high rate of femicide, of killing of women in families, um, or a man for that matter, your penalty is less than if you harm or kill a stranger. Now, why? Because he intuitively gets the connection that I describe in Nurturing Our Humanity based on neuroscience, that there is an inextricable connection between how children, what children observe, what children experience in their first years.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a family that is authoritarian, that is highly punitive, often violent, rigidly male dominated, uh, that is directly related to exactly the kind of state that Putin heads. Highly punitive, violent, authoritarian, rigidly male dominated. And we have really been taught, it's funny, it's almost like a spam blocker in our heads, to not look at the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
Because so I realized that I could not answer the questions of my childhood, and especially this question of whether there is an alternative using the conventional methods or the conventional categories as lenses.
Mm-hmm.
And to make a long story short, if you look at the whole picture, which includes the whole of our history, including the thousands of years of our prehistory, at the whole of humanity, starting with its two fundamental halves, male and female, and everybody in between, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the whole of our lives, including where we all live in our family and other intimate relations, then you have the database to begin to answer this question. And you begin to see patterns, configurations, social configurations that keep repeating themselves cross-culturally and transhistorically. And there
Well,
were
isn't
no
that the
names.
job of a cognitive scientist, right? It is to reveal these patterns of behavior and internally and externally in order, hopefully, to understand and perhaps even transcend them if they're not to the hmm, not sufficient for the activities to support human life.
Well, what I discovered were two configurations that are underlie all of the categories that we're used to. One is the domination system, and
Mhm.
one is the partnership system. And because it's always a matter of degree, there is the partnership domination social continuum or scale. Uh, and I'm afraid that the cognitive sciences have been just as fragmented as everything else.
Well, we tend to, even doctors now are so specialized that, and this is one of the things that we was talking with Howard Bloom about in the almost refuting the second law of thermodynamics and that everything goes into a state of entropy, whereas the universe seems to be looking, or at least promoting, a finer organizational structure and more harmony than cacophony, which is what we as human systems kind of create. We build systems, they work for a while, they fall apart. Empires are just an example of that.
Well, your friend, the Russian scientist, I agree that everything is interconnected. Where I don't agree is that all of us are undergoing this change, because what we're in, and we see it all around us, is a time of increasing polarization of the partnership and the domination system.
Mhm.
I mean, and it's whole systems polarization. If you look, for example, at the Taliban or at Iran, fundamentalist Iran, uh, they're not only dictatorships, but they rigidly control women and children
Mhm.
in families. See, that's the missing part of most analysis. If you look at where I came from, at Hitler's Germany, and strongman rule is hardly anything new, okay?
Right.
It is really the norm in the domination systems of most of recorded history, whether it's empires, as you said, or whether it's doesn't really matter. Uh, you see that. You see the norm of strongman rule, but in both the family and the state or tribe. And we are not used to thinking that way, are we?
Well, no, because we've been a male-dominated world. Patriarchal systems from the beginning were maligned in order to diminish women and control populations. Um,
Well,
it's
I think it's more than male dominated, although that is a part of the system.
Mhm.
It's domination, it's control.
I say male-dominated because the aggression side is generally from a masculine perspective,
Absolutely.
where the feminine is nurturing.
Well, the male socialization in domination systems is to not be like a woman. It's a very negative thing. You remember the stories of
Don't
blaming
cry,
Eve. And,
sissy.
yeah, well,
Those kinds of things. Yeah. How
well,
ridiculous.
you blame Eve and Pandora for all of man's ills, right? Um, so you have to distance yourself from the quote feminine, which is coded, caring, caregiving, nonviolence. So you see,
What do you think
there-
about the transition that we're experiencing now and the semi-new focus on servant leadership? That seems to carry that feminine energy, if you will, in a new way that makes it more acceptable. Is that what you're finding? And what do you think about that?
well, I think that's part of the partnership movement, the movement towards the partnership side.
Hmm.
But we can't really deny that there is also, I mean, look, the struggle for our future is not between right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern. I mean, as I started to illustrate, there have been rigid domination regimes in every one of our conventional categories, um, whether
Is that
they're
something we can
religious or
address
secular.
externally, or is it an internal process?
I don't know what you mean.
So in addressing, we see these things because we observe them, right? So in the changing or the transformation of them, do we address it at an external level, or does it have to come from an internal perspective that shifts perspective first.
Well, I think you're talking about paradigm, which we all internalize. And so I don't make the distinction. I mean, I think that there have always been people who have rejected domination systems, uh, starting in families, you
Mhm.
know. But the movement towards, but first of all, we, through thousands of years of our prehistory, and this, I emphasize all the findings from archaeology, from uh, folklore, you know, all these legends about an earlier, more peaceful and harmonious time. They're based on fact that we really did have this time.
Mhm. Well,
Uh,
even the Vedas, the 15,000 years old. When I had my experience in college of um, it, some may call it an NDE. It was I ended up in the light and beyond, given my marching orders, put back in my body, and said, "Here you go." Right. In order to find some kind of corroboration that allowed me to feel at least a little bit sane from the process, were the Vedas and the poems that revealed that we're divine threads, incarnate, connected to source, capable of God consciousness. Well, what's that mean? And how would you see that expressed? Because it seems to be this is tied into this idea of partnership, right? That we're loving and being loved, and that we're moving together in a way that serves everyone rather than a few. Do you see, can you speak to that? And do you see that? It seems that's an
but
integral
that
part of your work.
it is
And
integral, that is our alternative. And moreover, neuroscience, for example, and many psychological studies, well, neuroscience shows that the so-called pleasure centers of our brains light
Mhm,
up more when we share and care than when we win and dominate. Psychology shows that we feel better. We just feel better, you
mhm,
know. We really, when we care and share, that you know, there have been studies, for example, of people receiving gifts or giving gifts, and they feel better when they give
yeah.
the
The
gift.
who
So,
was it?
so
The
this,
Augsburger said that being heard is to normal people is almost indistinguishable from being loved.
well, we get neurological and chemical rewards for caring,
Mhm,
for love. I mean, we love our dog, right? I mean, it doesn't even have to be a person. It's built into us, but in domination systems, and this is really fundamental, that empathy, which is part of our evolution,
mhm,
is either compartmentalized or completely completely suppressed
mhm.
for members of out groups,
Right.
starting with the out group of women in a society that, because I mean, domination societies, the opposite of patriarchy is not matriarchy, it's partnership.
Right.
I mean, that's really, but we have been so conditioned. Even that is that, you know, that's the only alternative, either women or men, but mothers or fathers,
And if we give
patriarchy.
up control and we have this partnership, that means I can't control anything. What am I going to do? Right? These are these fears of the unknown that crop up that are really pretty silly at their level and yet affect this change in such a way that these inner conversations are important to have and to assuage these fears and bring forth a greater, an apocalypse, which is an uncovering of knowledge, which is what you're talking about in the partnership. It just feels natural to those who are capable of
Yes.
feeling. Now,
Well, I agree with you, but the problem is this compartmentalization
mhm,
into in-group and out-group. And it can be, look, I mean, what does a child learn in a punitive, male-controlled household? That child learns two lessons that are fundamental before their brains are fully formed, before their cognitive faculties are even there, their critical faculties. The first lesson is the ranking of the male half of humanity over the female half with rigid gender stereotypes.
Potentially, yeah. And that
Because
really,
well, how else can you rank them if you don't have rigid gender stereotypes and
in the
nothing,
dominant system, yes,
yeah, and
absolutely.
nothing in between.
Yeah.
So that's the first lesson that a child learns in that kind of a household. And that household is directly related. I mean, Hitler, for example, made no bones that the top priority of the Nazi state was family, women and children. Okay, and I can go into that. There was an interview of me in the Scientific American, which you might want to look at, because it's fairly recent. Just put in my name and Scientific American and it'll come up on that. But look, the problem is this. That's the first lesson. So you learn this in-group versus out-group thinking to equate difference, whether it's based on race, on religion,
Yeah.
on sexual orientation.
Early polarization paradigm input.
Exactly. But you learn to reserve, if you have any empathy left, for the in-group.
So what's the second thing?
The second thing is a child in a punitive, violent household. Like, why do you think that these so-called Christian parenting guides say that you have to not spoil the child, quote unquote?
Spare the rod, spoil the child.
By showing that the parent's will is law. What does the child really learn? It learns that
rebellion.
Well, that's a byproduct, but because we really don't know. I mean, we think all teens are rebellious, but against
just finding our own way.
Yeah, I mean, they're searching for their own way. But look, the child learns that punishment, violence is not only your fault, right? Because that's what we're told, but it learns that punishment and violence is not only normal, but moral. So this is socialization for a domination system to fit into it.
You'll probably enjoy one of the other things I'm involved with, many hats that I wear, the Live and Let Live.
The what?
Live and Let Live.
Yes.
Global peace movement. And what the premise is, mission basically is twofold. We have a moral principle and a legal principle. The moral is being an excellent human. We can't control what that is, but we can aspire to have certain values and reinforce those. The other is the legal principle. Don't aggress. And so we seek to remove anything in the law that allows aggression.
Well, I think you have to start with the family. You have to start
Agreed.
with parenting, because otherwise the system keeps rebuilding itself on the same foundations.
How do you think it is the best way to do it? One of the ways that I did it was creating a business plan based on holistic education, which included mind, body, spirit, planet, and cosmos. And we don't address our children to bring them into that kind of awareness. How do you feel it is a way to move things forward in how we empower our children in the educational process, to actually draw things out of them instead of trying to push all this crap into them?
Well, I wrote a book on a partnership education. It's called Tomorrow's Children. It also is very similar in a way, but it takes it brings it up to date to some of the Montessori principles. But look, I think that what we're talking about here is very fundamental. And you can't change you can change the system in bits and pieces, but it keeps building itself on the same foundations as a domination system in regression after regression. I mean, Hitler was such a regression. We're seeing regressions to authoritarianism all over the world today, including right here in the United States.
It's ubiquitous in some way, shape, or form.
And it is because people who really are very rigid. I mean, that's one thing that I found out about the dominator personality. It's based on denial of climate change, election results, COVID-19, you name it, in the
Right.
United States. But it's also very difficult for that type of personality to deal with change. So it reverts to the in-group versus out-group training. It's not that simple, but on a certain level, it's very simple. Childhood is when our brains are formed. We are not born with fully formed brains.
Mm-hmm.
And so you cannot change the system with only focusing on, when people hear the term violence, what do they think of? They think of war, they think of terrorism, maybe crime. But domestic violence, I'm trying to get
Emotional, intellectual, spiritual violence in the home is rampant.
well, and the term domestic violence has got to go because it immediately marginalizes it, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to get people to use the term family violence, violence in the family, get the media involved.
Mm-hmm.
But look, we have lacked the frame of what I call the four cornerstones on which domination or partnership systems rest. And a lot of our efforts for change have been, well, they've been without a frame.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the people pushing us back, they may not call it a domination system.
Well, and also when you step back and look at it, it seems that how we have everything structured doesn't allow for our children to be nurtured. You've got lock-key children, is what they call them, right? You've got two parents that are working, unable to be with their children, so they farm it out and, just to another vendor. And so there's all of these kinds of disconnections built into that system. How do you see that changing? And maybe you can weave those four pillars into that process as you share them.
Well, I think we need both tactics and short term, which is what most of what's happening, is triage, is intervention. And we
Mhm.
need that. But we also need long-term strategies, and we need this new frame of the partnership domination social scale, because if we don't have that new frame, we're constantly us against them. And these people who really are socialized to fit into the domination system, they didn't choose that.
Mhm.
And it certainly isn't a question of blame or shame. I mean, our parents just transmitted what
Did the best they could to give us what we've got.
Yeah, they just
Yeah.
transmitted, and they too were traumatized.
Yeah.
So the conversation about trauma, by the way, is a sign of movement towards partnership,
Mhm.
because we're beginning to recognize that a lot of what was considered normal, right, isn't. It's pathological.
Right.
But
And that's because we're talking about what's been happening inside, internally, individually, and internally in the family unit in order
right,
to explode these and look at them for opportunities to change and adjust. Thank you, Deb.
absolutely. You always have to look at the whole picture. I mean, there's a lot of talk about systems analysis, but believe me, most of the system analysis isn't, because
No,
we
they're not holistic.
they're not holistic. I mean, if you leave out women, if you leave out children, then you leave out family.
Mhm.
because that's where women and children in rigid domination systems, those that really orient to
Right.
that closely to that part of the scale,
Mhm.
that's all they're supposed to be, to
And,
do.
and yet this seems like a natural part of human development, of planetary citizen or citizenry or planetary civilization development. How do you see making the way a bit more conscious in
Uh,
order to facilitate the changes necessary?
well, I've written tons of
And you've got those four
articles.
principles that you still
I,
to
I,
talk
I,
about yet.
it's the four cornerstones,
Okay,
which
the
is
four
what,
corners.
at the end of Nurturing Our Humanity, those are the cornerstones. But look, one of the cornerstones is economics. You know that domination economics, and it isn't just neoliberalism, trickle down economics, which in itself, I mean, trickle down says it's domination economics, isn't it?
Hmm.
But they're brilliant at coining like neoliberalism. This is not new. I mean, look at Chinese emperors or Indian pashas or uh, feudalism or kings. I mean, this is we've about 5 to 10,000 years ago, there was this shift in our prehistory from a norm, mostly, of a partnership orientation,
Hmm.
starting with foraging societies, all the way to early agrarian societies like Çatalhöyük in Turkey, where there was no sign of destruction through warfare for 1,000 years. And where the archaeologists who excavated both Ian Hodder, for example, who was one of the latest archaeologists
Hmm.
who excavated there from Stanford, he wrote an article in the Scientific American that it was a gender balanced societies. It was what I call a Gailanic, Gyne,
And
Andros.
if we've done this before,
Yes, well, that's the
how
first
can
thing.
we harvest our past to nurture our future?
Well, it's the four cornerstones. The first one is childhood and family, and we've really talked a lot about that already.
Mhm.
The second one is gender. We are used to thinking of how the roles and relations of the two basic forms of humanity, male and female, are organized is just a women's issue, or maybe it's just a men's issue. Of course, that makes it a human issue, but,
Right.
everybody in between. Uh, but it's actually a fundamental social, family, and economic organizing principle. Remember how I said that children learn through this ranking of male over female and the feminine, rigid stereotypes, right, over the quote masculine, that they learn very early on, usually in their families, their peer groups, etc.
Hmm.
So it's kind of almost imprinted, and it's very difficult. I mean, what is really wonderful is the men's movement, the women's movement before that, the gay and transgender movement. I mean, but they're not.
People wanting
It's
to be heard, wanting to be recognized, and the diversity and ultimate capacity for unification that brings simply by recognizing the need for inclusion.
absolutely. But the third cornerstone, and I wrote a whole book called The Real Wealth of Nations about economics,
Hmm.
is fundamental. Why is economics that fundamental? Because we depend on what we consider valuable, like food
Absolutely.
and
Right.
uh, for
Whatever
survival.
that may be, whether it's time or material.
But we have inherited in both capitalism and socialism a gendered system of values.
Mm.
Remember that both capitalism and socialism came out of early industrial times in the West, the 1700s, the 1800s. We're now in the 21st century post-industrial era. So on that count alone, they'd be outdated as operating systems. But
Right.
it's much more than that. They exclude from the realm of economics the three life-sustaining sectors. Think about it. The natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy.
Absolutely. You know, the to speak to that for just a second, the SEC, I noticed that this been a couple of years ago at least, they introduced a new category, and that's natural asset company.
That's right.
And so now here's an opening to change the agenda, and this is how I like to put it. We're changing the agenda from profit over people and planet to people and planet over profit. Doesn't change the need for
Absolutely.
profit. It just redirects it and utilizes it where it's most applicable in order to serve a greater number of people.
Well, I mean, this is the new consciousness,
Mhm.
but it's emerging in bits and pieces. And we need really to look at the four cornerstones, because unless we shift to what I call a caring economics of partnerism, see, the whole argument between capitalism and socialism is it's a distraction, isn't it?
Yes.
Because both have informed our metrics. For example, look at GDP or GNP. A tree cannot be part of GDP only when it's dead, when it's a log.
Mm.
Does it become part of GDP? As for the work of caring in households, which according to a recent Australian study would constitute 50%. It's mostly done by women, of course, because that's, when Marx well, anyway, it would constitute 50% of the reported GDP.
I
But
love that catch. That would have been a great tangent to go off on, I'm sure.
yeah, well, that is the reality. But we are so conditioned. It's like fish, we're in the water. We've inherited our language, our stories, which is the fourth cornerstone, language and stories. We've got to change that. And from what I glean, you are changing some of that. So good for you.
Thank you. I hope to.
Well, we have to, but we have to change all four,
Mhm.
because our stories and our language have to include this frame. If we need the language of the domination and the partnership system, we need to look at hierarchy completely differently. I had to coin new words. Hierarchy of
And
domination, we
that's
all know that.
starcasting, right? Words have power, they have vibration. The more consciously we can use and apply them in the shift. And I did this with partnering workshops that I did for building road and bridge construction. Very adversarial environment to begin with. So to be able to take those folks and bring them, literally get them on the same page, takes that ability to listen, recraft, and offer a way to transcend that lower level mentality and serve something greater than they are.
Well, it is a question of, we hear so much about a revolution in consciousness, but again, it's a question of consciousness of what? And
Mm.
as long as we have it also fragmented by our stories, I mean, remember I told you about the stories about human nature, about the stories about woman, Eve, Pandora. She's
What
to be
about Lilith?
everything. What?
Lilith.
Oh, and Lilith. Well, I mean, but that's not as well known as Eve or Pandora,
I
because,
understand, and yet,
but Lilith, of course, is a rebelled, and for rebelling against
just
this.
like we were told Lucifer did, right?
Yeah, well, it's a strange thing that the clues, I mean, like and not just in the West, like the story of Eve and Adam and being kicked out of. When I was a kid, I always wanted to know, because it says in the Bible, henceforth, woman, it was
Right.
ordered by
Well,
Jehovah,
and
by
here's
Yahweh.
the
And
very big,
I wanted to know, what was it like before the henceforth?
yes.
And nobody wanted to talk about it.
Well, and here's the evidence of how women initially got minimized by the power of those in authority to put them there in how the Bible was formed and that woman came from man. Well, that immediately puts them subservient.
Well, you
Why?
know, there are two stories of creation in Genesis, and in one, uh, woman and man are created in the divine image. But the best known story, but that best known story actually has clues to our partnership past.
Hmm.
Because, like, when I was a kid, I also wanted to know, why would women ask advice from a snake? We don't usually do that.
Wisdom
But
carriers.
it was my research, for the Chalice and the Blade, that I found out that the snake was a symbol not only of the renewal, the cyclical renewal of life,
Ouroboros.
but also of oracular prophecy. Remember, in Delphi, already in dominator-oriented times, because Greece was very dominator-oriented,
Right.
uh, it was a priestess, a woman, working with a pythoness, she was called, because she worked with a python, with a snake, for her oracular prophecies. But so that part of the story harkens to the old reality. But the part of the story where you may not even think differently from what I order you to do or
Right.
think,
Well, again,
that's
that's the
the new
Western,
reality.
in the ancient stories and texts, the snake, dragons are all seen as
The
wisdom
enemy,
carriers, and right, they carry the codex of the universe, according to one, the Kamaras, the Amaru, Quetzalcoatl, um, Nagas, all names for the same androgynous serpent that carries the wisdom and
because as I said, the snake was the wisdom of the. I mean, we have to understand that when the first archaeologists first started to find evidence, for example, all these female figures, they saw it through the lenses of the domination system, which was
right,
stronger. I mean, I started to tell you that it's during a period of my work draws a lot from chaos theory, from nonlinear dynamics, from self-organizing theory. And it is simply that we know that during times of severe systems disequilibrium, systems can change, but they can also regress.
right.
And that is what happened in our prehistory. But fortunately, if you look at a history of 300 years ago, when the Industrial Revolution started to sort of really get going big time,
Hmm.
you got one social movement after another challenging the same thing, a tradition of domination. I mean, think about it. The Enlightenment, so-called rights of man movement,
Right.
then came the feminist movement, another challenging another tradition of domination, so-called divinely ordained right of
Right.
man to rule over the women and children in the castle of his home. Uh, then came the anti-colonial, the abolitionist, the civil rights movement, challenging another, the so-called divinely ordained right, always divinely ordained, by
Sure.
the way.
Well,
But religion, the issue isn't religion. It is really dominator infected religion, because at the core of most religious traditions are
well,
teachings, well, frankly, partnership, feminine
oh,
teaching.
absolutely. And the core, from what I gather from them, is simply to learn how to love and be loved.
Absolutely. That's the ancient wisdom. Well, we are in a very difficult but interesting and
Mm.
a time of hope. But the change has to be both social and personal.
Absolutely. And COVID, I think, gave us the opportunity, with the obsession on self-hygiene and sequestration, it gave everybody a chance to stop, look, listen, self-examine, and determine what set with them well, whether it was from their thinking or their feeling that something needed to change. And now all of these things with the virtual groups, with this podcast, is a result of that activity and the willingness to step up and say, okay, what can I do? How can I help forward this, at least reconsideration of how we're approaching things? And how do you see this potential? So we got the baby boomers. Let me frame this and give you just a couple of details to launch from. Baby boomers, largest population, was no longer. We got the Gen Zers coming up, right? It's supposed to be a bigger population, and they are more prone to look at things as simply, okay, this is just what it is. They don't want the fluff, they don't want the domination. They just want to be able to be and do in ways that they know are possible, however they know that, right? How do you or do you see this as a potential game changer in this wave of change?
Well, look at Tate and look at the regression among young men to domination that he preaches and all of his followers. It isn't that simple unless we have a new frame that this partnership domination, social scale, we can't really see what's going on.
Mhm.
And we keep arguing, you know, against this and against that. And instead of saying, look, we need both short-term tactics, but we need a new frame and we need to pay real attention to these four cornerstones, to childhood and family, to gender, to economics, and not shifting from capitalism to state capitalism, which is
There's
what
a bridge
socialism.
somewhere that just
Yeah, I
needs to
mean
be created.
because both perpetuated the gendered system of values. They're all interconnected.
Mhm.
And of course, story and language. And forget, it isn't hierarchy. I started to tell you about hierarchies of domination and hierarchies of actualization. Look, every society needs parents, needs teachers, needs leaders, uh, needs managers.
Right.
But there's a difference. And
It's an administration more than a hierarchy of control.
well, it's funny because a lot of the talk is still let's get rid of hierarchy, and that doesn't work. I mean, consensus can be real domination. One person can hold you up forever.
Hmm.
But
I've experienced that, right?
yeah, no, think about that for a minute.
Yeah.
But it's really, if you have a hierarchy of domination, you have power to over, right?
Mhm.
And that's entering the vocabulary, isn't it? Instead of power to, our creativity, our
Right.
real creativity. And that's a positive
Or
thing.
just to ask better questions of how can we? We know this is necessary. What do you think? How can we do this? What are your
That's right.
notions? And how, from a sort of leadership perspective, how is the organization served best?
Well,
And
I make a
what
distinction between innovation. I mean, the gas chambers were an innovation
yeah, and
and
true.
creativity.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's power with and power to, and that's entering the language, but it's also haphazard. Whereas the people pushing us back, look at the rightist fundamentalist alliance in the United States. Their social issues: one, family, control over children; two, gender, these rigid gender stereotypes, There's nobody in between, and you rank them. That's the second cornerstone. Economics, you identify with the people on top, just as you do in your family against punitive, you identify with the punitive parent because you have no choice. You're going to die if they don't feed you, if they don't clothe you, if they don't provide shelter, right? And story and language. We have to focus on those. If we don't change those, which are the underpinnings, we have to shift them from domination to partnership. And it isn't, again, a question of blaming men. It isn't a question of blame or shame.
Well, you point a finger, you got three of them coming back at you. So you really need to examine where you're at before you
Absolutely.
start doing that. And by doing so, this one disappears often.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's really a road plan
Hmm.
toward something concrete, not perfect. The perfect, the saying goes, is the enemy of the good, but much, much better.
So what do you think about the process of this, of incorporating these four principles and or cornerstones and being able to craft at least either a discussion, a framework, something, like some of the things I'm doing with Planetary Citizens, which is an effort that I've been working on for a number of years in this process of harmony among people and planet and how to facilitate people, places, and things to be part of that. So what I've done with Planetary Citizens, I took the co-creation wheel that came out of Spiral Dynamics, and I'm looking at breaking down those sectors into who's participating at what level, pioneer-wise, and beginning to help support them in sharing their message so that more people become educated, first of all, to have at least something more to consider. Like
Well,
if we're not being presented that, then how can we consider it?
how about book clubs to read some of these works describing the partnership and domination system?
It's
And
a
I
great
mean, that's
idea.
that's a a
We've
a
included that with Live and Let Live, our founder, Mark Victor's book. He's not complete yet, but he's offered it as a book club study for membership to look at, okay, this makes sense, this doesn't make sense. Let's tweak it so that the message is clear, better, and more deliverable. So these
Yeah, well,
kinds of,
I definitely think I wrote, as a matter of fact, quite a few books. You can look them up.
Mhm, I
But
noticed.
I mean, we have to re-examine our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future.
Now, how do you, and I have the same problems. I got 35 books out. They're not getting read. People aren't reading that much anymore. They're now moving into this 3 to 5 second or 3 to 5 minute scenario, or we were told in I taught high school for a number of years, and chunk it in 15-minute segments, otherwise you're going to lose them, was the general thinking. Now it's 3 to 5 minutes, or the 60-second shorts that are being just gobbled up by the Gen Zers and others. How do you see this being incorporated into the delivery of the messaging?
Well, look, I would start perhaps with my interview, which I guess is about 3 to 5 minutes
Hmm.
at Scientific American. I would look at some of I recently wrote an article for Compass, which is the publication of the World Futurist Society. Um, but there's nothing, you know how socialism spread? It was through discussion groups of all of the materials, through readings. And this is one of the real problems in our era. But people are beginning to read books again, starting with fiction. I wrote a book recently about my relationship with David, with my deceased husband, which hasn't come out yet, but it it it's all about relationship, isn't it? And people are interested in relationship. So I put this out, but you can reframe it. I would start with reframing it as you want a better relationship. Read some of these books. You want a better economic system? Read The Real Wealth of Nations, because it shows that care has been coded feminine and devalued. So there's nothing in either socialism or capitalism about caring for nature. And as for caring for people, it was to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. And that is the operating system that we still have, it reflected in our metrics, as I said. So you have to be almost a detective about our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future. And you have to look at the whole system and see patterns.
Absolutely, and sometimes finding those patterns are the surprise. You mentioned Putin earlier, and my wife being from the Soviet Union and not having a whole lot of experience with Putin, but knowing the shape it was in before the dissolution, and now over the last 20 some odd years, they have really, and she has a lot of friends in Russia still. The environment's transformed. That there's, yes, there are probably in some areas like you were talking about, there's that male dominance thing, areas of control of the government, but the generalized in the how the people are living, um, there's a sense of freedom and capacity that they have that wasn't there before.
But that is your wife's friends. The majority of Russians support Putin. And that's how he gets away with it, because they have been brainwashed and traumatized, frankly.
Well, maybe
Into
that's part of it, and maybe they're expecting that behavior because it has been so inundated. And yeah, there's some things I see it, there's others I don't. And far be it from me to point fingers and judge when there may be other aspects, like for instance, him sending medical aid to Italy, the only one in the world that did that during COVID. So those kinds of activities are counterintuitive to what you might think someone like him would do.
well, he's a former KB,
I understand all that, and I do know that, like we've been talking about, the evolution of how we perceive the world and what we see as becoming necessary in order for us all to move together forward better. Some things may change. People may change. And we don't know
I
what's
think
going
it's
on
going to be very,
inside of that.
very, very difficult for somebody like Putin to really change. And if he sent aid to Italy, it was for a strategic
Yeah, to me,
goal he
not to
had.
dissuade you or to,
But look, it's not a question of blaming Putin. Putin had a miserable childhood. Hitler had a miserable childhood. I mean, we have to really understand
I
this.
understand too, but we also have to be willing to look past that and let them be seen in a new way rather than continuing to put them in that same frame that they've always been in. We've got
Well,
to give them that
and that is
opportunity.
exactly what this work that I've been doing for all these years is about, is changing our frame.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we sorely need to do that. And Rianne, this has been such a wonderful conversation and enlightening and so precious, especially now and in honoring the insight and wisdom that you carry from the decades of work that you've been involved with to assist this apocalypse, if you will, of uncovering knowledge. And
We're talking about reconstruction rather than deconstruction.
yeah.
Not let's forget about disruption,
Well,
because
and there again, the word apocalypse, right? You ask that of 90% of the people, they say, oh, it's a catastrophic end of the world. Well, when you go back, do your research. What's the word actually mean? And let's start there in that reformation. And it means uncovering knowledge.
All right. Well, let's uncover knowledge
I think we have,
and
don't you?
let's do it together. So listen,
Absolutely.
it's been a pleasure to talk with you, and I look forward to your book clubs and to all of the rest of the work. And if people want more information about this, they can go to centerforpartnership.org.
Very good. Thank you again, Diane.
Bye-bye.
Brianne. And namaste and in Lak'ech. And thank you for tuning in and sticking with us for this episode of One World in a New World. I'm your host, Zen Benefiel, and I will see you next time.